I'm goddamn sick of anti-militia drills. You're telling me. Not like I don't understand it, though. Jason listened from a sewer grate as the two interior cadets chatted just a few feet above him. The imposing mass of the hospital building stood outlined behind them, and even with the poor angle, he could see interior troops scrambling all over it like a horde of ants. Which meant that the battle for the place was already over, and had, apparently, gone terribly for the militia. Oh? Enlighten me. The conversation above him continued, the two recruits totally ignorant of his frustration, as he desperately tried to think of what to do next. The periphery woman. Recruit 1 chided her fellow. Don't you watch the fucking news? Recruit 2 just shrugged. Figures. Recruit 1 scoffed. It's turning into a real clusterfuck out there. Yokels are acting up about something or other. Earth's getting hotter too. That got Jason's attention. Recruit 2's too. Earth? The sex planet? You have to be joking. Recruit 1 laughed. I shit you not. Apparently the regulars raided some guy's house and found he'd been trying to design a goddamn railgun. Get this. He was using a battery from an old Halcom auto. They still make those? Recruit 2 shook her head before scoffing. I'm shaking in my boots at the thought of a bunch of swimsuit models running around with a slightly fancier rock lobber made from old delivery drone parts. News reports said it could be pretty serious, Recruit 1 argued. Bah. News likes to exaggerate for ratings. I'll take sexy alien freedom fighters over periphery rebels or roaches any day. Can't disagree there. Recruit 2 glanced around conspiratorially. You might even get a chance today. Apparently the regulars we shipped in have a human with them. Lucky bitches. I wouldn't mind a few minutes alone to interrogate him. Join the queue. Recruit 2 laughed, the sound sending an unexpected shiver down Jason's spine. Which from what I've heard might still let you have a turn. According to the net, well, they just keep going and going. You're fucking with me, Recruit 1 said as the pair started to walk away. Swear by the Empress it's true. Jason listened to the pair's voices fade away before turning back to the waiting forms of Riokan and Tarsal as he tried to calm his racing heart and not dwell on what he'd just heard. It didn't matter to him. Earth was light years away. He was here. He repeated the mantra over and over again. How is it out there? Riokan asked. Not great, Jason admitted. Tarsal cursed before turning back to look at him. So, what do we do? Jason glanced back out as a large vehicle wheeled into the hospital's courtyard. He knew it wasn't a tank, given that Shulvanti disdained them, nor was it an AA vehicle, given the lack of weapons. He didn't have to spend long guessing, though, as he watched an incredibly fancily dressed Shulvanti clamber out, drawing salutes from those around her. I think I might have an idea, Jason said, a predatory grin forming on his face, as he turned back to face his pod. We might have to wait here for a few more hours, though. He didn't need to see either of his friends' faces to imagine the looks of dismay that crossed both of them. Spending most of his days stuck in a dank pipe wasn't exactly Jason's idea of a good time, but if his plan was to have any chance of success, it had to be done at night. Besides, it wasn't like he spent the entire time twiddling his thumbs. He'd been keeping an eye on the hospital and making notes of the interior's patrol routes. He'd also been intermittently checking to see if comms had come back online. They hadn't, but he hadn't exactly expected them to, given that he was pretty sure the source of the jamming was a ship parked in orbit. Watching the clock in the upper right of his vision, he let out a sigh of relief as the timer finally counted to 0. Sloshing back down the tunnel as quietly as he could, he came to the junction where Riokan and Tarsal were both napping in preparation for the heist. Part of him was internally grumbling at the fact that the pair had more or less slept through the monotony of the last few hours, but another part of him reminded himself that he was the one who insisted on it. Shulvanti might have had about the same amount of operational time as a human, but their ability focus deteriorated a lot faster if they went beyond it. By contrast, while he didn't exactly enjoy pulling an all-nighter, Jason had more or less become accustomed to them, even before he'd arrived at the Crucible. Get up, he grunted, none too gently nudging each of them with his foot. To their credit, both of them snapped awake with surprising alacrity. His time? Riokan asked as she scooped up her weapon and clambered to her feet. It's time. Jason nodded as he handed Tarsal his weapon. Guard change should happen in about 40 minutes. Plenty of time for them to do what they needed to do, or get shot before they even made it into the building, but that had always been a possibility. They were a trio of recruits with some basic combat training under their belt, not commandos. Jason was making this up as he went along. "All right," he said, seeing that the others were ready. "Anyone got anything they need clarification on before we do this?" He'd gone over it all earlier, but it was always possible someone had forgotten or thought of something while they had been taking a tunnel nap. "Just one," Tarsal said, a hint of nervousness in his voice. "Why are we stealing the truck again?" Jason shrugged. "It looks important and might make for a decent getaway vehicle. I don't know about you, but I don't want to be hopping that wall while being shot at, least of all if we're trying to escort cargo." He figured it was pretty much a guarantee they were going to trip an alarm eventually. He didn't want to rely purely on his intended distraction to keep the interior off his back. "I suppose," Tarsal said dubiously, "though I'm beginning to think that Phyrexia might have been onto something. You're actually pretty good at this." Jason's head whipped around. "You have to be joking." "Well, we're here, aren't we?" Rysha pointed out. "I don't see anyone else about to sneak into the Interior Command Center." "Because no one else was crazy enough to consider crawling through the sewers across half the city," Tarsal pointed out. Rysha continued as if the male hadn't spoken. "And now you've made a plan that has us, you know." Jason resisted the urge to scoff as she trailed off, as if she couldn't even say it. The pair of them made it sound like they were doing something that would get them tried in The Hague, or the Shilvanti Hague equivalent. It was ridiculous. It was a war game. They were supposed to be using whatever means they had to hand to win. Besides, the interior cadets would be fine, provided they were all wearing their suits and masks, which was supposed to be mandatory for the duration of the exercise. And if one wasn't, well, that was hardly his fault. He wasn't about to pull his punches because of the possibility of carelessness on an enemy's part. Besides, he had little doubt that a battery of instructors were watching the exercise with their helmet cameras, and if any of them had issue with his plan, none of them had made it known. Ignorant of his thoughts, Tarsal continued on. "I mean, I've heard about stuff like that happening on Earth." "You have?" Jason asked, turning back to his friend in surprise. He was surprised because he sure as shit hadn't heard about anything of the sort. Both of the aliens nodded, though. Jason found himself gaping before a scowl formed on his face. Maybe he wasn't giving Shilvanti's censors enough credit. Apparently they were doing a better job of obfuscating the truth than he expected. Sure, he hadn't exactly been looking for it, but normally you expected that kind of doctrine to be, well, obvious. Apparently not. Sighing, he turned his mind back to the topic at hand, something he absently noted he'd been doing a lot lately in regards to Earth. "I had us tromp through the absurdly spacious sewers for a few blocks and then came up with a half-baked plan when we got here," he said. "It was hardly rocket science." Honestly, he might have been more comfortable with rocket science. Rysha laughed quietly. "Would you have ever considered going through the sewers, Tarsal?" "Not in 100 years, the male answered with a deadpan tone. "Not even if I was charged with saving the Empress herself." "Me neither," Rysha agreed, arms crossed over her chest. "Nor would anyone else I know. It's crazy. It's like Hannibal taking the elephants over the mountains." "It's not..." Jason dismissed before a thought occurred to him. "You know about that?" "Well, yeah," Rysha said with surprising sheepishness. "After you mentioned him, I did a little research." Now Tarsal was staring too. "For pictures at first," Rysha stammered, as if that was somehow more acceptable. "But I actually found the history, kinda cool too. It was like something out of the Ilios saga." Jason continued to stare at the awkward alien for a few more seconds before shaking his head. Fascinating as this was, they could talk about it later. "Right, well, if nobody has any other observations, I'd say it's time to go." Seeing neither had anything else to say, Jason started walking back down the tunnel, his guts churning uncomfortably as he tried to think of all the ways this could go south. One step at a time, he reminded himself. Encounter a problem, work through it, repeat. One step at a time. Jason waited with bated breath for the interior sentries to turn the corner as they made another loop of the outer courtyard wall. Now, if the statistical averages held true, they had about 30 seconds before the next pair appeared. The gap between these two groups had originally been shorter, but as the evening wore on, it had gotten longer and longer as either boredom or lack of sleep affected the pairs in question. "Go," he hissed, sending them all sprinting towards the wall, weapons slung over their backs. Within seconds, he and Tarsal had their back pressed against it. "Up we go," Jason whispered, as they both used their hands as footholds for Rysha to clamber up. For all that he'd cursed the wall on the obstacle course enough times, he was thankful for the experience now, as he reached up for Raicha's hand, allowing the woman to pull him over the wall from her position perched at the top. Tarsa was quick to follow, and within moments, they were inside the compound. He let out a relieved sigh as he saw there were no guards inside, which wasn't entirely unexpected. The interior only had so many people, and he had no idea how many layers of defences they bypassed already by using the tunnels to get so close to the hospital. Regardless, it seemed the outer courtyard walls were where the interior's innermost defences stopped. Assuming there weren't more sentries inside the buildings themselves, whatever. They crossed that bridge if they encountered it. He didn't need to say anything before Tarsa and Raicha darted off their desperate tasks. Jason, in turn, took off towards his own objective, the large hospital building at the centre of the compound. Slowing down as he reached the building's massive outer doors, Jason kept his weapon raised and ready as he cautiously stepped inside, his heart pounding in his chest as adrenaline ran through his system. The sound of his breathing seemed incredibly loud in his ears, and though he knew none of the noise would penetrate through the mask, he did his best to stifle it. The hospital was just as run down inside as any other building, mould growing on the fabric of the waiting room chairs. Fortunately, beyond a tiny lizard-like creature that quickly skittered away at the sight of him, no one was there to greet him as he stepped through the foyer and into the first hallway. Keeping an eye out for signs as much as sentries, he still found his head craning inside as he stepped past the first room in the hall. Despite the fact that he was expecting it, he still felt his heart skip a beat as he saw the rows upon rows of sleeping Shorvanti inside. The interior cadets had commandeered the old hospital beds, a fairly gross proposition given the state of said beds, but given that all of them were wearing sealed combat suits, a marginally better proposition than the hard, tired floor. Moving on, he kept looking for signage that would direct him to somewhere important, somewhere like the head doctor's office. Of course, the temptation was that such a place was on a higher level, but he knew that was a human bias. Shorvanti built out when they could, even if this particular building had prompted them to have multiple levels. No. When it came to showing off prestige, the ground coverage of a building was what mattered, not its height. Therefore, if you wanted to find the most important place in a Shorvanti building, you had to go in. Jason continued his journey, wincing every time his feet moved over loose dirt or skittered against a bit of rubble. The place felt like a labyrinth, even if he knew it wasn't all that large. Right, just down this hall, and... He stopped as he mentally ran through the last few moments. Stepping back, he peeked into a room and confirmed what he thought he saw. An interior cadet, passed out on a relatively clean bed, her mask on the nightstand next to her. Shit, he hissed as he glanced up at his timer. He only had 5 more minutes until Tarsal made his move. Not long at all. He rushed over to her side, cursing the woman for endangering her own life for a little more comfortable snooze. The rules were clear. Suits and masks until the exercise was over. At most, they were allowed to lift it to eat and drink, and only in areas they felt were safe. Whatever that meant. Glancing around, he was relieved to see the one in front of him was the exception rather than the rule. All the others had their masks on. His little rebel here had probably pulled hers off after everyone else went to sleep and planned to wake up earlier and put it back on before anyone else wised up. He was just about to pick up the mask and begin the painfully delicate process of trying to slide it over her head without waking her, when he stopped. He recognized her. "You have to be shitting me," he whispered under his breath. Of all the shitty coincidences, it just had to be one of the girls from his night out. The one that had been friends with Terrence. Hick or Helk or something. Of their own volition, his hands moved away from the helmet and he raised his gun. He could shoot her, leave her paralyzed in her armor. When Tarsal made his move, she'd be stuck. Vulnerable. In the confusion, she might even get left behind. It would be a horrific accident. It wouldn't be his fault, though. The rules were clear after all, and his plan presented no real threat to anyone who followed them. His finger hesitated on the trigger. She deserved it. So very richly. She probably wouldn't even be hurt. It was only a possibility after all. In all likelihood, she'd be fine.
Do it.
There was always that chance, though. Fuck, he cursed under his breath. Swiping the helmet off the nightstand, he watched as it rolled under a nearby bed. That would have to do. He sprinted out of the room. He'd get even. Properly even. Not just a haphazard attempt in the middle of a training exercise. He made up his mind. After this was all over, he'd go to the instructors, tell them what happened on his night off. The thought seemed to soothe him as he clambered up the stairs, having completed his search of the first floor, only to freeze as he rounded the corner and found himself staring into the surprised face mask of an interior cadet. Still, even if they were both surprised, his reflexes were faster, and his gun came up in one smooth motion, the short barrel proving to be a boon as he put a burst of shots straight into her chest. The armor that Shorvanti wore had a nigh mythical reputation on Earth, given the many videos of Shorvanti Marines striding to gunfare with little more to show for it than the odd stumble. Still, the kid was not infallible, and Shorvanti weapon tech was just as effective, especially at close range. The woman fell like a statue, her armor freezing up as she was killed, frozen, in the act of raising her weapon. "What the fuck?" her muffled voice cursed as she hit the floor. "Dead people don't talk," he reminded her as he jumped over her, clicking open the door she'd been standing guard against. Inside, he found a fairly stately room, occupied by a single fancy bed and a massive window that surveyed the hospital grounds. "What in the Empress's name?" the same fancy dressed Shorvanti from earlier said as she threw off her sheets. Jason had to give her credit. Barely a moment passed between her waking up, her masked gaze landing on him, and her reaching for the pistol on her nightstand. Unfortunately, that was a moment too long, given that his weapon was already up and ready. Still, he wasn't here for an assassination, and it took him a moment longer to acquire his target. The Shorvanti actually managed to grip her weapon before his first shot took her in the upper arm, and she managed to raise it before the limb froze up completely. Jason's next few shots hit her left arm, left leg, and right leg respectively. The Shorvanti, Colonel apparently, fell to the floor in an ungainly heap, each limb turned rock solid. Threats dealt with, Jason slammed the heavy wooden doors behind him before dragging a mouldy bookcase in front of them. The screech of wood being dragged across tile seemed incredible in the quiet of the night, but he figured the time for stealth had passed the moment he practically ran face first into the guard outside the Colonel's room. As evidenced by the fact that he could already hear shouting and the pounding of feet from the hall he'd just been in. For the moment, they seemed more confused than angry, but he figured that it would be a matter of seconds before they found the dead guard and realized they were under attack. With that in mind, he could only hope that Riokan and Tarsal had completed their objectives. If they hadn't, he'd be making his last stand in the next few minutes, after finishing off the downed colonel, of course. Almost of his own volition, his mind jumped at the words of the sentries from before, and he found his stomach churning. While he was reasonably sure it was just locker room talk, he still felt more than a little discomforted at the thought of being captured. As he ran over to the bed and started ripping the sheets off, he considered that perhaps he would best be served, saving his last shot for himself. "Ma'am, are you okay?" A muffled shout came from the door. "What do you think, you idiots?" the woman shouted from the floor. Jason thought about instructing her to shut up, but decided it would be a waste of time. Time he had little of, as a powerful thump heralded the interior's attempts to open the doorway. Fortunately, the heavy wood held, but he doubted it would do so for long. "Honestly," the woman on the floor grunted, craning to look at him as best she could. "I've no idea how you got in here, but it would be in your best interest to surrender now, male. Whatever you had planned, it's clearly failed." Jason glanced up at the timer in his HUD, and was dismayed to see that the number was at 0. "Maybe," he admitted, as he walked over to the woman, dragging her along the floor like the world's most ungainly sack of potatoes, much to her vocal dismay. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Jason ignored her as he used the butt of his gun to break the glass of the window, though he tried to keep low in case anyone tried to shoot him from the outside. He felt a shiver go up his spine as a crack from behind him heralded the first break in the door's exterior. There was now a gap in the wood of the door, and he had to dive to the side to avoid the barrel that stuck through. Crawling across the floor, he grabbed the down squawking colonel, propping her up as an impromptu shield. "If you don't want to get knocked out of this competition here and now, I tell your girls to call it with the shooting." He didn't need to see the officer's face to imagine the scowl that formed there, but the woman was prompt in her response. "Quit shooting, idiots," she instructed, "before you hit me." He noticed she didn't say anything about stopping the attempts to break the door down, and he was reasonably sure she was whispering instructions into her comms, as evidenced by the sound of shoulders barging into wood recommencing. Jason momentarily considered threatening his sausage to try and get them to stop, but the sound of wheels crunching across the concrete equivalent outside cut off that train of thought. "Come on, Riokan," he murmured. "Don't fail me now." "What are you?" The officer's question cut off with a shriek as Jason levered her over the edge and out the window. He winced a little as the sound of her body hitting something metallic before thumping to the floor, but he figured she was fine. Besides, he was doing the same thing. Clambering over the edge, he glanced down to see the APC thing pop beneath them. That's a little higher up than I remembered, he thought, as he considered the two-story plunge. Then he heard a loud crack as the door behind him finally gave way, and he leapt from the window as interior recruits clambered through the shattered doorway and into the room. The sensation of falling was mercifully brief, though the sensation of hitting the floor lingered a tad longer. The armor he was wearing was great, but it was powerless to protect him against the power of inertia, as he very much felt his internal organs bounce around as he hit the floor of the APC. "Jason!" Raicha's scandalized voice shouted, and he looked over to see her bodily dragging the downed colonel to the back of the vehicle. "You said you were going to lower her on a bedsheet rope. You dropped her." "She's fine," Jason grunted as he rolled off the vehicle and onto the floor, very much aware of the armed recruits who were bound to start shooting from the window above, or the window across the courtyard, or from the courtyard walls. Lots of places, really. "I am not fine, you insane monkey!" the colonel shouted as he clambered into the crew section, and Raicha moved for the compartment into the driver's seat. "You dropped me from a window!" "You're fine," he said, as he slammed a button on the wall, closing the rear ramp. Then he took a moment to actually look around. This isn't just an APC, he murmured, as he saw the many consoles, headsets, and buttons built into the walls of the machine. "Of course not! It's a mobile command unit," the downed officer harumphed. That was good. Then he didn't get any more time to think on it, as he was knocked off his feet by the vehicle accelerating forward. Cursing as he was pressed up against the wall, he clambered to his feet once more, none too delicately stepping over the colonel as he moved to the front of the MCU. Peering into the front compartment, he saw Raicha at the controls as she directed the vehicle towards another of the buildings. "There he is," Raicha murmured, and Jason glanced up to see Tarsil clambering down from the building's fire escape. It was hard not to notice that he was limping though, or that bits of rust around him kept exploding into dust, announcing that his pod member was being shot at. Eventually though, the male made it to the floor with a final hop, though he could have jumped the last bit in Jason's opinion. Ignoring the officer's complaints about him climbing over her, he opened the rear ramp, pulling his friend into the vehicle, before closing it again. "Punch it, Raicha," he shouted. "What?" she called back. "Drive, woman," Tarsil ordered, a hint of shrillness in his voice. They were both being bowled over as Raicha hit the gas, sending the MCU shooting forward. He didn't hear so much as feel the vehicle smash through the hospital's outer courtyard wall, which was rather annoying to him because he specifically told her to go through the gate, lest they accidentally run some poor interior sentry over. Shulvanti armor was good, but he rather doubted it was tank-proof. Still, they were away now, prize in hand. He'd actually pulled it off. Jason, you have your hand on my..." Jason looked down and realized that both he and Tarsil were locked in a fairly compromising position. It also didn't take a genius to hear the blush in his friend's voice. Resisting the urge to sigh, Jason went about disentangling himself from his friend, offering the guy a hand as he regained his feet. Rather than let the male dwell on it though, he switched the subject entirely. "We did it," he laughed. "We're home free." Tarsil's embarrassed body language changed in an instant as he straightened up, pride pervading the smaller male's posture as he leaned against the console. "And it seems we stole their MCU," he said. Not bad at all." "No, it's not bad," the interior colonel said from her own, less than dignified position. "Now if you think you're safe, you're delusional. Even as we speak, my women will be gearing up to hunt you down." Somewhat miffed at the interruption, Jason nonetheless smiled as he bonelessly sank onto a nearby stool. "Oh, I don't know about that," he said. "I imagine they'll be more concerned with the fire." "Fire? What fire?" Jason craned his head towards the front of the vehicle. "Raicha, do you know if there's any way to..." He lapsed into silence as one of the nearby screens lit up, displaying the feed from what was apparently one of the interior's overhead drones. On it, he could see as one of the hospital's buildings was already engulfed in flames, armoured figures stumbling from it, as others ran around like headless chickens. It was chaos. Even from her down position, the colonel could see the screen. But how? He gestured to Tarsil, who had forgone a seat entirely, sinking to the floor. When you get right down to it, the basics between a magnifying glass and a laser rifle aren't all that different. Both are just a means to focus heat and light. To her credit, the woman was quick to catch on. "You had your comrade gain a commanding vantage and had him use his weapon to start fires." "Got it in one," Jason nodded as he reclined in his seat, trying to calm the pounding of his heart. He'd done it. He'd succeeded. Against all odds, the sensation of victory was sweet, one he'd almost thought forgotten. Instead, he grasped it once. Jason, we've got a problem up here. Oh, come on, he hissed, clambering uncertainly to his feet.